So I was totally wrong about how much hobbits drank. They drank so much more. Hi, I'm Harrison. I'm a certified sommelier, huge fan of all things Tolkien, and your Mid-Earth Somm. So in a video we just put out trying to pin down just how drunk an average pint of ale would get a hobbit, I came to the conclusion that for every 1.5 pints a hobbit drank, it would be the equivalent of a non-halfling drinking a 40 ounce.
Edward 40 has it in!
So basically just over half as much. But, as some of you pointed out, pints in the UK and the US are totally different. This is important to note because Tolkien was a British citizen, and thus his understanding of the word pint would reflect the amount served in his local pubs, not what we see in the United States. So, in the US, a standard pint is 16 ounces, or 473 milliliters. In the UK, a standard pint is 20 ounces, or 568 milliliters. So if we go back to our handy-dandy BAC calculator, and we average out the blood alcohol content, one British pint would give an average hobbit at 3 foot 6 inches and 108.9 pounds, we get 0.07. So in other words, just under the legal limit for intoxication. Now, to get the same level of intoxication for an average big folk person, who we calculated would be 5 feet 5 inches and 172.9 pounds, they would have to drink 32 ounces of the same brew. So basically an imperial pint plus a standard bottle of the same ale. So yeah, an imperial pint would still just royally fuck up a hobbit. Even more so than we originally thought. Next, the nuts and bolts, or rather, grains and kettles, of brewing the perfect hobbit pint.
Sorry, that one was bad. That was so bad.
What beer exactly were the hobbits brewing in the Shire? And more importantly, did Samwise Gamgee have a secret microbrewery in Bag End Cellar? So when we look at hobbits and what beer they'd ultimately be brewing, we have to ask ourselves, what technology and grains are available, how do hobbits drink culturally, and what do they define as good beer? First, let's talk ingredients. So the basic ingredients of any beer are the grains being fermented, the hops or hop substitutes used to add flavor and preserve the beer, water, and yeast. Luckily enough for us, Tolkien gives us an answer straight away. The hobbits are fermenting barley, which is an excellent choice. Most beers are fermented almost wholly or partially from barley. Now, the second question, what hops did the hobbits use, or even did the hobbits use hops at all, is going to lead us down two very different paths. For as long as humans have been brewing beer, and some say that we've been doing it for almost 12,000 years, hops have only definitively been used for around the last 1,000. The beers of ancient civilizations of the Fertile Crescent, the Egyptians, and the Germanic tribes to the north, and even the beer enjoyed in the medieval ages, looked very different than what we have now. The first recorded use of hops was somewhere in the 800s, but didn't become commonplace in brewing until the 1400s. Before then, beer was flavored and preserved by a proprietary blend of herbs called gruit, often a blend of such herbs as bog myrtle, rosemary, laurel, sweet gale, and yarrow. I don't know what any of these taste like, but I imagine that they taste like an old English ivy wall. Dirty, rat-infested, mossy, but with a hint of like rose. Remember that without the bitter flavors added by hops, beer would taste very malty and very sweet. Different regions produce different hops that will impart flavors ranging from lemongrass and green herbs all the way to juicy pineapple and tropical fruit notes. Second question, water. Well, we can assume the hobbits are pulling from their local river sources, including the Brandywine River and its tributaries, so most likely snowmelt, and possibly harder water, like what we see in England itself. Good enough for beer? Good enough to keep the Nazgul away. Now the last ingredient, yeasts. Were the hobbits cultivating yeast strains, saving some from each fermentation and adding it back in order to preserve a house style, passing it down generation to generation like some sort of yeast of power? Or were they simply letting their ale sit uncovered, exposed to the open air, and letting it take in wild yeasts from the surrounding countryside? Yes, I know that sounds gross, but this technique is still used today and is one of the main reasons you like the beers you like, you sick weirdos. Were they doing some combination of both? any of these options will have a significant impact on the final outcome. Remember that yeast is the key ingredient in brewing that metabolizes sugars and turns them into alcohol and imparts unique flavors based on the strain. Lastly, we have to ask ourselves, what equipment did the hobbits have to ferment in? Now, my gut tells me they would mostly be working with barrels, sometimes possibly used barrels from their winemaking endeavors. But it's possible they might be brewing in cast iron or copper kettles. They may even have gotten the money to trade with the dwarves and have something more resembling the modern industrial vessels we use today. Which leads us to an even bigger question. Should we even be trying to figure out the historically accurate beer the hobbits would be enjoying? I mean, looking for a true historical analog is ultimately kind of a fruitless endeavor. Tolkien's world takes place in the distant past, before the modern written record. It includes an amalgamation of technology, crops, clothing, and customs not seen together before the modern era. Middle-earth is decisively fashioned after a medieval setting, but the Shire had mechanical clocks, for Iluvatar's sake. The hobbits are basically an Edwardian steampunk civilization plopped down into medieval Anglo-Saxon England. Oh, I've had too much NA beer.
Oh man, that's really gonna knock you out later, huh?
But before I get to what beer I think the hobbits were actually drinking, I do think it's worthy exploring just what a historically accurate beer would have looked like. So follow along in the next part as I try to get down to the bottom of what kind of beer were the hobbits drinking.